You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 27th of September 2019 on Monocle 24. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, coming to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead... As China gears up to mark the 70th anniversary of the People's Republic, we ask if the Hong Kong protesters will ruin the party. Austria votes this weekend, 3 years early. We'll look at the collapse of the coalition and examine the state of the far right. Then, the United Nations discusses the total elimination of nuclear weapons. But how realistic is that prospect? Plus,
this court has already concluded that the Prime Minister's advice to Her Majesty was unlawful, void and of no effect.
She's been a judge on MasterChef, has an impressive jewellery collection and is the first female president of the Supreme Court. We'll find out more about Lady Hale, whose landmark judgment has radically influenced British politics. We'll also get the latest aviation news and have a look through the newspapers too. That's all ahead, right here on The Globalist, live from London. First, here are some of the other news stories we're keeping an eye on today. Democrats are urging people who might have more information about President Donald Trump's effort to persuade Ukraine to investigate his political rival Joe Biden to come forward, as Trump struggles to contain the fallout from the scandal. Teenage activist Greta Thunberg, who inspired a flight-shaming movement against air travel, is spearheading a climate change strike today in Montreal, where UN aviation leaders are gathering to debate plane emission targets. And in Saudi Arabia, the tourism minister has announced that the country will begin welcoming international visitors for the first time, hoping to cut its economic dependence on oil and see the tourism sector rise from 3 to 10% of gross domestic product by 2030. And now to the top story of this programme. On October the 1st, Beijing will mark the 70th anniversary of the People's Republic, and huge celebrations, including a massive military parade, are planned. The event means an enormous security crackdown, not just in mainland China, but also in Hong Kong, where it's feared that the protesters who've been holding anti-government protests for close to 4 months now will use the opportunity to embarrass the government. Well, joining me in the studio are Professor Steve Tsang, the director of the China Institute at SOAS, the University of London, and Karina Choi from our Hong Kong bureau. Thanks both for coming in this morning. Karina, let's begin by discussing Hong Kong. Carrie Lam has been holding community talks there to try and solve the crisis. Do we know if she's made any headway?
So Carrie Lam held her first town hall yesterday, where she invited 150 members of the public to come in and air their grievances. But what she hoped for didn't end up happening. And instead, there were several moving statements coming from young people who grew up in the city saying that they grew up with the idea that they would live with a high degree of autonomy and that they just don't feel safe anymore. Several people have questioned her decision to not go forward with an independent probe into police brutality, questioning whether she really has something to hide. So the meeting was a bit of a failure on her part, as majority of the people who spoke directly insulted her administration. And people coming out of the event, obviously it was surrounded by riot police who had tear gas and pepper spray at the ready. People coming out of the event said like they just didn't feel safe at all.
Steve, was it what Lam wanted?
Well, it was kind of what Lam wanted, but she handled it very badly. This kind of town hall meetings could really be very useful in getting people in Hong Kong to talk rather than to go on to demonstrate. Hong Kong is an incredibly safe place. She should have gone into the town hall meeting with no deployment of police officers, and there's no question that her personal safety would never be at risk. She should have simply said, whoever wants to come, I will listen, and actually listened, and let people shout at her. She couldn't do that. So she cannot do what she set out to do, which is to calm Hong Kong down.
I mean, Karina, the last time there was a large public anniversary in Hong Kong was July the 1st, when the city-state commemorates the anniversary of the handover from Britain to China. Now, it was a spark point for protesters. They ransacked the legislature. So Lam must be extremely anxious to try and avoid a similar situation. And I wonder what measures are being put in place.
Yes, even in the past few weeks, there has been very heavy police presence in train stations and also at the airport, of course, in malls. Protesters have been occupying malls recently as well. And so this is all just some way to sort of scare protesters from coming out on the streets. Obviously, it hasn't worked. I'm sure water cannons, pepper spray, tear gas are at the ready as well, and police will use those if necessary. I was out by Legco on July 1st, and it was interesting to see how people were sort of breaking into the building, but the police were sort of, taking a step back on the inside, watching what will happen and sort of acting at the very last minute. And it will be interesting to see if a similar case will happen on October 1st.
I mean, Steve, how much pressure is Beijing putting on Hong Kong to ensure that the government isn't embarrassed?
Oh, enormous amount of pressure. I think Beijing's bottom line is that a bit of demonstrations in Hong Kong on the 1st of October is fine. They can accept that. But keep it under control. No major issues that would be hugely embarrassing for Beijing. Do not let the international media steal the limelight from the big celebrations in Beijing. So Hong Kong does have a bit of scope to try to manage it itself. But it will require Carrie Lam being able to do the right things. And so far, she's got one right idea, the town hall meetings, but she still hasn't learned how to manage it.
I mean, she's explored all of this. She had a big op-ed in the New York Times, didn't she, Karina?
Yes, and in the op-ed, she sort of spoke about how, peaceful protests have always been a trademark of Hong Kong society, and how people need to come together and be united and march peacefully when it comes to the weekend protests. But this has sort of added fuel to the fire because she's still not being responsive at all. And just to add to what Steve said just now, I think this pressure from Beijing is just unspoken about. The flag-raising ceremony on October 1st in Hong Kong has been moved inside. There obviously will be very heavy police presence, and everyone who has been attended to the event needs to arrive at 7:15 in the morning, including press. And so the police have also approved of 2 organized marches this coming weekend and on Tuesday, and it's their way of giving protests less of a reason to exert violence on that day.
Because this weekend's important. It's the 5th anniversary of the Umbrella Movement. I mean, obviously that's going to add impetus to the demonstrators. Do we know how protesters plan to disrupt the day? Yes,
it's no surprise if we see just large-scale marches. The Civil Human Rights Front, the organization behind some of the biggest marches we've seen so far, have been given the green light, and many of the organizers have said that these marches are an occasion to mourn the lives that have been sacrificed over the past 70 years, and the people who have lost their lives, who have committed suicide throughout the period of these past 4 months as well.
Steve, let's turn to the mainland now and the preparations for October the 1st. I wonder how important this date is to the Chinese state and how they're preparing for it.
Well, the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China has been picked by Xi Jinping as a major celebration to mark the achievements of the PRC, really to mark the achievements of Xi Jinping. And this is why it is so important that he cannot allow this to flop. He is there sending a message to the party, to the country, to the rest of the world, to showcase the achievements and the glory of the PRC, which all comes because of the Communist Party, at the head of which is, of course, Xi Jinping. Now you have a bunch of kids in Hong Kong, from his perspective, totally spoiled brats who are out there having eaten too much food and coming out to spoil his his big celebration, he's not going to stand for that.
So how do you think he'll react? I mean, is it finally time for Beijing to bring boots on the ground?
Not yet. If by boots on the ground, we are talking about sending in of Chinese security forces. I think a lot will depend on what actually happened on the day in Hong Kong. If you have, for example, the central government's liaison office in Hong Kong being attacked successfully by, say, petrol bombs type of things, then I think the risk of the Chinese coming out very hard will be much, much stronger. But if you're talking about the fairly, by now, regular type of small-scale violence that are being contained in areas which are not particularly symbolic, I think they can probably tolerate that.
In Beijing itself, there are going to be huge military parades and fireworks, all sorts of displays going on. Do we expect protests there?
In Beijing, not a squeak. And this is exactly the whole point of it. This is what Xi Jinping is used to. This is what Xi Jinping expects. And for something like this, they would have been preparing it for a very, very long time. Beijing is practically in a lockdown situation. It's not only just in Beijing. You have factories in major cities outside of Beijing already being asked to turn some of those lock the factories up so that they are not polluting the air, to make sure that Beijing will have a blue sky day, so that the PLA Air Force will fly there and do all the aerial acrobatics and show off what they can actually achieve. This is the kind of things we're dealing with.
Karina, I wonder how much the people of Beijing are involved in this, because we're hearing all sorts of reports that actually they won't be able to go and watch this themselves. They can see it on television, and that they're being affected by things like nightclubs being shut down, as well as factories and people losing wages in that way.
Yes, only a small group of people, a relatively small group of people, have been invited to attend the October 1st parade, including potentially Carrie Lam. And rehearsals have been going on for over the past few weeks. In Tiananmen Square, police have asked hotel guests around the area to stay inside for several hours. So this has caused a lot of disruption, not only to hotel guests, but just to the surrounding traffic as well.
I wonder, you mentioned Tiananmen Square there. I wonder, Steve, if the new young generation of protesters remember what happened, and if that history of heavy-handedness is also what prevents people from continuing any kind of protest.
The younger generations in China believe that the Communist Party of China heroically dealt with some kind of a nondescript rebellion around Tiananmen Square, and that was the foundation of the enormous achievements of China in the last 30 years. Most Chinese of the younger generation who did not live through it have no idea of what actually happened in Beijing. The idea that there was this massive massacre simply has been erased from textbooks and from history in China. Now, you always have a small number of them who have been overseas or who have managed to so-called scale the Great Firewall of China, who know that there is a bit of a problem there. But that is not the overwhelming majority of them. China is a hard Leninist state which has a monopoly of the truth and a monopoly of history.
Karina, I mean, you're of that generation. So how much do you and your peers know about it, and how influenced are you?
I think for the people who have grown up in Hong Kong and who just don't really have a way out, it's extremely terrifying. I mean, seeing those images, we obviously didn't live through it. We obviously didn't experience it ourselves. We've heard these stories from our parents. We've seen the images in the news. So it's extremely intimidating, and I think that is the reason why people are still out on the streets. They know that to some extent there is the freedom to protest in Hong Kong. There is the freedom to voice their opinions, and they're making them heard for as long as they can.
And finally, Steve, Karina mentioned earlier that Carrie Lam may well be at the Beijing celebrations, but of course that's going to be a measure of Xi's trust in her, whether she is actually invited or not. Do you expect her to be there?
I don't, actually. I think Carrie Lam probably would stay in Hong Kong to focus on the situation in Hong Kong. Carrie Lam is incompetent, but she is not an evil person. And I think when she organized the town hall meetings, she is clearly aware that if in the run-up to October 1st, and indeed on October 1st, things should go out of hands in Hong Kong, there will be dire consequences for Hong Kong, and she's trying her level best to avoid that.
Steve, thanks very much indeed. That's Steve Tsang and Karina Choi there. On Sunday, Austrians go to the polls a full 3 years ahead of time, following the collapse of the governing coalition. Opinion polls suggest the Greens will do well. So does this mean that environmental concerns have eclipsed migration as the hot election topic? Well, Tessa Szyszkowicz is the UK correspondent of the Austrian weekly Profil, and she joins me in the studio now. Thanks for coming in, Tessa. Why did the coalition collapse?
Well, maybe you remember the famous Ibiza video that appeared in May and was published by Der Spiegel and the Süddeutsche Zeitung, in which the leader of the far-right FPÖ could be seen having a long conversation with a Russian oligarch's niece and was willing to sell out state contracts in exchange for her money. He would sort of slash critical journalism by having her take over shares in the biggest newspapers in Austria, these kind of things. So it turned out all of this was a setup, but he still was fired by the prime minister from the coalition. And that's where we stand now, because it seems that this whole scandal about this 18-month coalition between far-right and Conservative Party has not harmed the Prime Minister Sebastian Kurz at the time. It has harmed the far-right FPÖ a little, but not enough in order to not be considered again now as a coalition partner. So that's a very strange thing that is happening. So we don't know who we wake up with on Monday.
So there are 8 parties running in the election. In terms of who you do wake up with on Monday, who are the main ones and what do they stand for?
So the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, who will be the next Prime Minister, that seems to be quite clear because he polls around 33%. He's a conservative, centre-right, populist, young leader who is now probably able to choose between the smaller parties as coalition partners. So the second biggest probably will be Social Democratic Party, who polls around 22-23%, followed by the far-right FPÖ on 21%. So the fourth one, as you mentioned before, the Green Party has had a certain surge in the polls in the last weeks, but it's still only polling around 11%. So if you go together with the small Liberal Party, the Green Party, and either the Social Democrats, if they win, but that's quite unlikely, it's more likely that Sebastian Kurz wins and could go into a coalition with those smaller parties, or he goes back to his old coalition partner, the far-right FPÖ.
Which is extremely worrying for the rest of Europe.
Well, we've seen what they did when they were in coalition. So there were internal scandals, there were scandals with having still contact to the far-right groups outside of parliament, like the identitarians who had contact with the Christchurch attackers. I mean, there's a certain political problem that is still not acceptable for European standards. But because Sebastian Kurz is not the far-right himself, he's just in coalition with them, he seems to be a little bit more easier to digest in a coalition with them than you have, the Italian government till a few weeks ago with Mr. Salvini, or the Hungarian government that is sort of the far right itself. So that's why I don't think the European Union leaders would react, because he's now not presenting this as a new reform project anymore, because we've already seen that it doesn't work.
I mean, looking at the wider political landscape, are we essentially seeing a restructuring of traditional politics?
Oh, certainly. I mean, you can see it here in this country. There are similarities also to the Austrian case, where the old people's parties have moved from the center a little bit to either the left or the right, and who doesn't is losing votes. So Sebastian Kurz has remodeled the Conservative Party of Austria to his sort of young populist style, where he constantly sees, what is the topic of the day, and he still tries to push the anti-immigration agenda relatively successfully, I think, because the Austrians seem to be open to this kind of rhetoric. But he also, of course, has to play a little bit now towards the new Fridays for Future feeling. But because he's a rather conservative person, that's not a very credible point. So we will see if this will damage him in the elections. The Social Democrats are struggling. I mean, they are sort of trying to come out of this rather inflexible, traditional Social Democratic Party style, being, strong influence of unions and political topics that seem a little bit old-fashioned. So that's why they probably won't be the big winners of the day on Sunday.
In terms of the Greens and the whole Fridays for Future movement, I mean, one of the polls that was done in Austria was really interesting, because it actually polled people who can't vote on the day. So those were migrants and people who don't have citizenship and can't vote there. And that was really saying that there was a surge for Green support. And so I wonder what this means for the population as a whole. It might be that registered voters are swinging to the right, but actually the population doesn't reflect that.
Well, but that's precisely the point. People without the passport, the ones who are arriving, see that the Green Party and the Social Democratic Party are more immigrant friendly. Voters are polarizing. I think the Greens do well precisely because we had such a backlash under the previous government, which was very anti-immigration and still is. Both parties are still sort of running on this platform, while a lot of voters still think that Sebastian Kurz is right, that we should close our borders and that we should sort of have laws against all sorts of things like political Islam and headscarves and I don't know what.
Tessa, thank you very much indeed. That's Tessa Szyszkowicz. Now, still to come on the programme, the United Nations discusses nuclear proliferation. This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
No one has more. No one knows more.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Yesterday at the United Nations General Assembly, there was a meeting to commemorate and promote the International Day for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. But at a time when the United States has withdrawn from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces INF Treaty, is this goal now unattainable? Well, Paul Rogers is a professor of peace studies at Bradford University, and he joins me on the line now. Paul, why hasn't there been more proliferation? Only 9 states after 70 plus years.
The line is up, but there's nothing happening.
Paul, can you hear us now? I think we may have an issue with Paul's line there. So we're just discussing the meeting that took place in the United Nations yesterday. It was a plenary session to commemorate and promote the International Day for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. And what I'm interested in learning from Paul Rogers, who's the professor of peace studies at Bradford University, is whether or why, after 70 years, Paul, only 9 states are weaponized.
It's a point which is worth remembering at all times because there have been some examples of states really going a long way to develop nuclear weapons, then pulling back. And one state, South Africa, actually had nuclear weapons and voluntarily gave them up at the end of apartheid. But states like Switzerland, Sweden, several others. There was a sort of mini arms race in Latin America between Argentina and Brazil. All that was curbed. And the reality is that for a number of different reasons, most states that could develop nuclear weapons have decided not to, either because they're too expensive or because they feel it does not add to their security. The number is still limited, and that actually is pretty welcome, because I would have to say with all honesty, people who worked in this field, including me 25 years ago, had expected a worse situation. And it's a good counter to the fact that in other respects we do have major problems.
So why then do nuclear states want to keep them when most other countries want them to go?
It's partly status, it's partly really what they are used to and how it fits in with their defense policies. Obviously, much of it got a huge boost at the start of the Cold War back in the late 1940s, with the Soviets desperate to catch up with the Americans, and that has continued right through. Some states, you have the regional elements. Israel is one, North Korea is another, India and Pakistan too. You also find that in the case of two states, Britain and France, they at the start in the 40s and 50s consider themselves almost superpowers, sort of leading powers. And for them, particularly with their permanent seats on the Security Council, nuclear weapons were a must to demonstrate their status. So it's a mixture of messages. Again, it is worth saying that the incredibly dangerous period of the Cold War has somewhat eased because many of the weapons have been withdrawn. But we still have some thousands of nuclear weapons, so to that extent, there's still considerable dangers.
Well, how much danger? I mean, is it greater or less than in the 1980s, for instance?
Well, I put it this way. In the 1980s, there were so many nuclear weapons at different levels of sophistication and different sizes. We were dealing in total with over 60,000 nuclear weapons at the peak, mostly held by the Americans and the Russians and the Soviets. And in a sense, there was always a small risk of an utter catastrophe, a worldwide nuclear confrontation. That is much reduced now, but the risk of what people crudely call small nuclear wars in far-off places or sudden escalations of otherwise low-level conflict is still there. Now, in a way, that's actually more difficult to argue against, because instead of saying we're looking over the precipice as an absolute disaster, it's more of a slippery slope to a possible lower-level nuclear confrontation, which will end up with people even almost getting used to their idea of being used. And that, I think, is one of the problems at the moment, particularly because most of the nuclear powers are in the process of increasing the sophistication, if not the size of their arsenals. But that, I think, is the problem that people don't seem to realize.
So, I mean, that fear that we had during the Cold War, that there would be some worldwide apocalypse, isn't realistic.
It's not at the level it was. I mean, it could still happen under extraordinary circumstances. You might get an escalation between, say, the United States and Russia, but the risk is lower. The risk of nuclear weapons being used in some ways may even be higher, because it would have been such an utter disaster before that there might have been a tendency to hold back. But the worry is, for example, a major escalation in the Middle East, or particularly between India and Pakistan, might lead to things going over the edge. So it's at that level, not worldwide, but still very serious.
So was the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, really as significant as some people claim? And what is the consequence of that falling apart?
It's very much symbolic. At the time, the thing about the INF Treaty, which goes right back to the 1980s, was that it actually banned state-of-the-art weapons. Most arms control treaties basically clear up stuff which is becoming obsolete, sadly. They're not really serious in that sense. INF was different because the cruise missiles, the Pershing IIs, the Soviet SS-20s were the modern state-of-the-art weapons, and those were cleared out. Also, there was very tight verification. Each country had high levels of confidence that the other was not cheated. You could do challenge inspections and all sorts. And to that extent, I think the loss of this treaty is symbolically important, because it was one which really did have some real meaning. It doesn't mean that the situation is disastrous, but it does mean, for example, we're facing a possible escalation, both from the Russians and the Americans, both of whom are testing at least, and in the Russian case, possibly deploying systems which could be readily nuclear armed, which actually break the treaty. So to that extent, it is significant, yes.
So could the global community really get rid of nuclear weapons?
It will take a long time, but the good news, in a sense, is that this planned UN nuclear weapons convention, in other words, banning nuclear weapons, is making some progress. And as we know, we did have the meeting earlier this week. That actually sets out to ban nuclear weapons. Quite a number of countries have signed it, but the key thing is ratification. A treaty like this is not ratified until, I think it's 50 countries have signed. They're already up in the mid-30s, so there's progress being made. That does not mean that because the UN says nuclear weapons are illegal, then, the countries that have them will get rid of them. Far from it. But what it does do is begin to sort of alter the balance of pressure towards the idea that we can scale down far more. I have to say that if any one country was to take really major steps to go back to an absolute minimum of a handful of weapons, that will be a step forward. It's going to be a long job, though, to actually get rid of nuclear weapons overall. And there are many obstacles. But in a sense, the Nuclear Weapons Convention reminds us that many, many countries do not want to have a nuclear-armed world. And that, I think, is something on the good side.
Were there any major takeaways from that meeting yesterday?
Not especially. I mean, I think one or two countries did add their ratification. It was a way for the UN, under the current Secretary-General, to try and keep the pressure on. But essentially, the progress is slow but steady. A few larger countries like Mexico, have actually now ratified the treaty, and that is quite a big step forward. But we do, I'm afraid, still have a long way to go.
Paul, in the 1980s, we with this huge kind of push for anti-nuclear, CND and all the rest of it, and that was where there was a lot of protest concentrated around that organisation. Even when you look at their logo now, I wonder if climate change occupies that area that nuclear weapons once did. You have compare CND to Extinction Rebellion and all the kinds of people you see supporting this movement.
I think that's true. CND does still continue to exist. It's quite strong. It's had a renewed membership. The fascinating thing is that there is a branch of Extinction Rebellion, XR Peace, and that actually links the two. It points to the fact that if there was a real climate breakdown, then one of the reasons would be the huge use of the high levels of carbon emissions from the military. It also points out to the fact that if there was a real disaster on the climate side, as we seem to be heading for, then you would have the much greater risk of smaller wars, with always the risk that they would escalate. But I would agree with you, the main emphasis currently is on climate change. Many people would say that rightly, but the trouble is it does mean that we're forgetting about the other example. Putting it very widely, as a human species, we have to get to the ability to control our own ability to destroy ourselves through nuclear weapons and control our ability to wreck the environment. And in some ways, I think almost philosophically, those should be linked perhaps more than they are.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. That was Paul Rogers. Here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. In the US, Democrats are urging people who might have more information about President Donald Trump's effort to persuade Ukraine to investigate his political rival Joe Biden to come forward as Trump struggles to contain the fallout from the scandal. A whistleblower report said he not only abused his office in attempting to solicit Ukraine's interference in the 2020 US election, but that the White House tried to lock down evidence about that conduct. Teenage activist Greta Thunberg, who inspired a flight-shaming movement against air travel, is spearheading a climate change strike today in Montreal, where UN aviation leaders are gathering to debate plane emission targets. The 16-year-old Swede is in Canada to support the protest, which is taking place less than a month before a federal election, where, according to recent polls, the environment is voters' top issue. And in Saudi Arabia, the tourism minister has announced that the country will begin welcoming international tourists for the first time. This is part of a wider push to cut its economic dependence on oil. Riyadh aims to secure foreign investment in the tourism industry and hopes to see the sector rise from 3 to 10% of gross domestic product by 2030. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, constitutional law became as exciting as possible this week when the President of the UK's Supreme Court, Lady Hale, delivered the bombshell that Boris Johnson's decision to suspend Parliament was illegal. When people had finally recovered from the shock that the House of Commons was to be forcibly reopened, they began to ask, who on earth is Lady Hale? Monocle's contributing editor, Andrew Muller, reports.
This court has already concluded that the Prime Minister's advice to Her Majesty was unlawful, void, and of no effect. This means that the order in council to which it led was also unlawful, void, and of no effect.
As recently as Monday evening, Baroness Hale of Richmond was known only to a smallish circle of British constitutional law obsessives, political journalists, and other friendless weirdos. On Tuesday morning, Lady Hale became suddenly extremely famous.
When the Royal Commissioners walked into the House of Lords, it was as if they had walked in with a blank sheet of paper. The prorogation was also void and of no effect.
As President of the UK Supreme Court, it was her job to read the court's judgment as to whether the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, had behaved unlawfully in advising the Queen to prorogue Parliament. That verdict was nonetheless brutal for the calmness of Lady Hale's delivery. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the Prime Minister's advice to the Queen was unlawful, void, and of no effect. The UK Supreme Court was only established in 2009. It took over the judicial duties which used to be carried out by the House of Lords. It does not have anything like, for example, the presence in general public life of its American equivalent. So, among the many questions raised by the judgment, at least among many baffled British citizens, were, hang on, who is Lady Hale? And why is she wearing an enormous silver spider on her right shoulder? The latter question is quickly answered. Lady Hale has a fondness for bold brooches, and while she has been rarely photographed, has rarely been photographed without one. Tuesday's spider brooch was an instant sensation. T-shirts featuring a replica were available within hours. So, inevitably, were fervid conspiracy theories claiming to divine some secret signal from the Illuminati secreted in the disposition of the shimmering arachnid's legs. Brenda Marjorie Hale, who, among her many other distinctions, has the most English name in England, was born in Leeds in 1945 and raised in the Yorkshire seaside town of Redcar. Her subsequent career would be impressive in any era, but Hale worked her way through the United Kingdom's legal hierarchy at a time when women with ambitions in law were, if they were lucky, indulged as an amusing oddity, especially if they'd hailed, as Hale did, from a state school in the north. At Cambridge University, she attended the then all-female Girton College. There were 6 women in her law class of more than 100 students. Hale finished top of it with a starred first. Hale initially dedicated herself more to the academy than practice, teaching for 18 years at the University of Manchester. The trajectory to her present role began properly in 1984, when she became the first woman and youngest person ever appointed to the Law Commission, the body which subjects the laws of England and Wales to ongoing review. Since then, Hale has served as a judge in the Family Division of the High Court, become only the second woman appointed to the Court of Appeal, and in 2004 the first female Lord of Appeal in Ordinary, better known as a Law Lord, one of the 12 judges selected from the House of Lords to perform judicial functions. The Supreme Court superseded the Law Lords upon its establishment, and Hale became its first female justice. She is now its first female president. Lady Hale is due to retire at the end of this year. Her biggest case will be among her last. Not all of the recognition she has received this week will have been the kind of recognition she would have wanted, still less the kind of recognition she merits. Those Brexiters who claim to want British courts to uphold British law have been curiously angry about exactly that.
Twice they have been asked to let the electorate decide upon whether they should continue to sit in their seats, while they block 17.4 million people's votes. This Parliament is a disgrace.
But it is because of the Supreme Court's stout defence of parliamentary sovereignty that Lady Hale's remarkable career has become nearly as appreciated as her taste in jewellery, and so it should be. For Monocle 24, I'm Andrew Muller.
Thank you very much to Andrew. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle 24. Let's continue now with today's newspapers, and joining me in the studio is Ian Anderson, former political advisor and chairman of the international communications agency Cicero Group. Ian, thanks for coming in.
Morning.
Now, Donald Trump. It is in many of the papers, and certainly all the US papers. He tried to lock down the Ukraine call records.
That's right. So this is, I'm looking at the New York Times today, no friend of Donald Trump before or throughout his presidency so far. And they're leading on effectively the alleged cover-up story that the recording of the call, the tapes of the call. How often did we hear about the tapes being requisitioned in a former impeachment case? I'm thinking, of course, about Richard Nixon back in the 1970s. So this is essentially a story about the potential for an alleged cover-up here, and that the tapes were held in a secure White House server. Now, Trump today is railing against the whistleblower. It appears the whistleblower is a former CIA or current CIA operative. He's also railing against traitorous White House staff. So he's having a go about his own court and those who are around him. Just watching the president yesterday, I think just looking at the body language, this is the first time a blow has really landed. It's the reason why Nancy Pelosi, who's been very, very, very careful on the whole impeachment issue, she's had a whole bunch of people in her own party in the House of Representatives that have really wanted to go for impeachment since the midterm elections. I think she believes she's found the smoking gun.
Yeah, and I mean, he really is rattled now, it would appear. I mean, the Times is also very interesting in this. It has a table, how the whistle was blown, and it talks about the anonymous whistleblower, then the watchdog, who was Michael Atkinson, the Inspector General for the intelligence community. Now, he concluded that Trump may have illegally solicited a foreign campaign contribution. And then on to the intelligence chief, Joseph Maguire. Now, he, having received this credible complaint, he should have sent it to Congress, and there appears to be some issues around that. And then, of course, we come to Stephen Engel, who's the head of the Justice Department, their Office of Legal Counsel. He's ruled that Maguire could refuse to hand over the complaint to Congress. Yeah,
that's right. And look, as we're debating here in the UK right now, impeachment is both a legal course, but it's also a political judgment. In order for impeachment to successfully take place, this whole process would have to be ratified by both houses. The impeachment itself would be heard in the Senate. And there are, the Democrats clearly want to wound a Republican president, particularly this GOP president. But the real question, and I think the spotlight is going to move very, very quickly towards whether or not Republican lawmakers in the Senate are prepared to go with the Nancy Pelosi process.
And interestingly enough, a recent poll showed 34%, I think it was, of Republicans are actually in favour now. So, I mean, those numbers are constantly shifting, but very, very interesting. Let's look at the crisis closest to home. I mean, they're almost indistinguishable. The news is breaking, both sides of the Atlantic. Let's have a look at Brexit and the Times headline, "Deliver Brexit or Face Riots."
Yeah, now, depending on your preference here, this kind of headline is either a really depressing take on the state of British politics right now and the I mean, rancour doesn't even begin to describe it. I mean, I've been a Westminster geek, a Westminster watcher for all of my professional life, and the anger, the name calling, the abuse, frankly, on both sides. Let's call a spade on both sides of Parliament earlier this week, as Parliament reassembled, has been pretty horrendous. But if you look at Dominic Cummings, and that's, of course, Boris Johnson's chief strategist, this is what you might classically call a headline to create a dead cat bouncing, rather than having an ongoing conversation about a Prime Minister that misled Parliament, misled the British head of state in the Queen, and unlawfully created a proroguement, and therefore a brand new constitutional precedent has been set in this country, both by Johnson but also by the courts, who've effectively made new law as opposed to just that precedent. We're having a debate about language and rancour and angriness and getting Brexit done or not getting Brexit done. Depending on your preference, this is either about depressingly the state of our politics, or actually it takes the debate far away from a Prime Minister being found to be unlawful in the highest court of the land.
And it is affecting every area of society. I was invited to an event with Dominic Cummings last night, and I found myself unable to go. I just thought, I cannot be in the same room as this amount of toxicity.
But this is the problem. I mean, we've looked in, certainly from Europe, at the American debate for the past decade, and you can tune into your channel of choice. You can be an MSNBC Democrat, or you can be a GOP Fox News watching supporter. And we're not talking to each other anymore. I mean, actually, you and Dominic Cummings may be better to be in the same room. You might be having a row, but I mean, the problem right now is, unfortunately, certainly between now and the end of October, I can only see this getting worse.
Absolutely. Well, from that to a man who seemed to have united a nation, at least for some time, and that, of course, is Jacques Chirac, who has died.
Yeah, this is, I'm looking at Le Monde, and, they're describing him as both the father and the grandfather of French generations. A real sense of a time when leaders lasted longer. I mean, in the post-war era, the only president to have lasted longer than Chirac was Mitterrand, and that's only because Chirac changed the length of term of a French president down from 7 years to 5 years. He firmly opposed, he was the European leader that firmly opposed any intervention with George Bush in Iraq, and spoke out pretty firmly against that. And in terms of the way in which he ran France, he wasn't a radical. He didn't fundamentally create rupture in the economic settlement, in the social settlement in France. He founded his own political party, which, of course, Nicolas Sarkozy then ripped up, and now we're in a completely new kind of place with Macron, who then founded a new political party. It seems you have to find your own political party in France in order to be president these days. But, you read the headlines and you read and think about a different time. Of course, the end of his life was mired with significant controversy about whether or not, now he's passed away, whether or not there was corruption around his time in political office. But the headlines today are very generous.
They certainly are. And I think if you want to go to our archives, there is a nice obituary of Chirac there. You can find it under the briefing. Finally, there is the most wonderful app I need this. All airlines need this. Tell us about what Japan Airlines has done.
So I'm looking at The Guardian, and Japan Airlines now has this tool to, as they say, tackle the horror of screaming babies. You know what it's like. You get on board a flight, short haul, long haul, and there's a mum and dad sat with their baby, and the baby doesn't want to be on the plane, and you know you're going to require that gin and tonic and a nice pair of headphones for the next few hours ahead. I mean, interestingly, so basically what you can do is you can see where families are sitting, and there's a rather fun picture of a baby, and you can work out whether or not to be 4, 5, 6, 10 rows away from that child. I mean, it would be great if the app also identified noisy snorers and people who have that lovely habit of reclining their seat back into your lap as well, but I think that might be a little bit more difficult to do.
I'm sure it's coming, though. We need to identify serial offenders and then absolutely flag them up every time they
Well, I'm sure everyone's digital footprint now can basically tell the airlines whether they're a serial snorer, carrying a baby, or just generally noisy.
Absolutely. And in fact, there's a story about how Alexa is now going to follow us around so that we can have Alexa in our headphones and in our glasses and all the rest of it. This is the future.
Isn't the world getting better, Georgina?
Well, certainly that app would make it better. Ian Anderson, thank you very much indeed. This is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage, built on the unique dedication of our people. We bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work, and we know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in weekly to The Bulletin with UBS for all the latest insights and opinions from UBS and experts from around the world.
It's time to get some aviation news now with Ellis Taylor, Asia editor at aviation analytics firm Cirium. Ellis, thanks for joining us. Now, the World Routes Conference has been taking place in Adelaide this week, and there was interesting news from Air India.
There certainly was. Air India is sort of by default now the sole long-haul carrier in India since the demise of Jet Airways in April. And some senior executives there sort of spilled the beans that they have some plans to, in effect, double their fleet and actually add a few more on, taking up to 250 aircraft in the next 4 years. But there's a big catch, and that is that the government has the airline up for sale at the moment, or is planning to start a process to sell the airline off. And then really it'll be up to the new owners to decide whether to execute that plan, whether to do a little bit of it, a lot of it, basically to do the whole thing, to decide whether that moves forward or not.
But there's a further catch because, of course, this is not the first time the airline's been up for sale and there were no takers last time.
That's right. So last year, the government tried to sell a 76% stake in the airline. So the fair question to ask is, what's different now? Well, one of the big things that the government has done is they've created a special purpose vehicle that's taking some of the assets and about half the debt load that Air India has. It's a bit over $1 billion. And it's sort of hoped by cleaning up the balance sheet like that this time around, there'll be at least one, if not a number of other bidders that'll come in. Also, with Jet Airways out of the market, it is now de facto India's only long-haul carrier. So that's something that could appeal to potential bidders.
Yeah. Now, following the crash of the two Boeing 737 MAXs, the company's been looking at how to salvage their reputation and their sales. How do they plan to do that?
So there's a few efforts underway, but over the last week, what we've seen is that Boeing has had an internal review that's been led by its board and some independent safety analysts. And they've really come up with some efforts to, what they say, realign the core engineering function of the company. So they're going to create a position of a chief engineer who will work right across its commercial airplanes, its defense businesses, and its space and security businesses. And essentially, I guess, brings some engineering rigor to the development right across the company. So there's that going on. We're still waiting to find out when the 737 MAX will return to service, but the company seems to be sticking to a plan for by the end of the year. So it'll be interesting to see how those internal changes really sort of bear themselves out. And really, we probably won't see that for another few years yet.
Now, there seems to be a bit of a spat between two Australian carriers when it comes to slots at Tokyo Haneda Airport. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this is quite an interesting story. Tokyo Haneda Airport is much closer to downtown Tokyo compared to the more distant Narita. And the slots there are really at a premium. And we've seen in the past that US carriers kind of fall over themselves whenever the US gets allocated some. And we're starting to see that in Australia now. Australia had one slot, and now they've been given an additional 2 slots by the Japanese government. And Qantas is trying to take both of those slots to open up one new route to Melbourne and double its services from Sydney to Haneda. But we've seen Virgin Australia sort of come in, and they want to launch a completely new route from Brisbane to Haneda. So it's a contested thing at the moment, and the signs are that, for competition reasons, I imagine that Virgin will end up picking up one of the slots and Qantas might get the other.
And finally, just before we go, we know that Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old climate activist, is in Canada today. Now, she is spearheading a flight-shaming movement. There's a huge march going on in Canada. Trudeau is joining in, as is the leader of the Greens there. How serious is this for the aviation industry?
It's something that's been on the mind of the industry for the last few months. It's sort of really escalated to something that there's been a mixed response to it. A lot of airlines and a lot of people would say, well, the idea of flying less is certainly admirable. But for business to happen, for connections to be made, that people still need to inevitably use aircraft.
Ellis, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. That was Ellis Taylor. And that's all we have for today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Augustine Macellari and Paige Reynolds, our researcher, Naomi Potter and Will Higginbotham, and our studio manager, Kenya Scarlett. More music on the way. The briefing is at live at midday in London. I'll be back tomorrow for Monocle Weekends, when our editor, Andrew Tuck, will be discussing the Vox takeover of New York Magazine. And on Meet the Writers, my guest will be the co-founder of Netflix, Mark Randolph. The Globalist returns at the same time on Monday. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.